I'd always admired Mr. Harland, my neighbor, an older man who kept to himself. He was the kind of guy you'd see in the mornings, giving a polite nod as he watered his plants or took his dog, Rufus, for a walk. I'd never thought twice about him. But lately, something wasn't sitting right. A few weeks ago, I started noticing a faint light flickering from his basement window late at night. At first, I figured it was just an old bulb shorting out. But the light was strange, pulsing almost like a heartbeat. It would flicker slowly at first, then quicken, casting erratic shadows across the walls of his basement. Each night, the pattern seemed to change, but I shrugged it off as a quirk of aging wiring or something. One night, though, I couldn't help myself. The pulsing light had intensified, and shadows stretched up from the window, dark shapes dancing in the glow. I felt a strange pull, like I was supposed to see what was happening down there. I snuck out, quiet as I could, making my way around his house until I was close enough to peer into the basement window. The basement was packed with old furniture draped in white sheets, and dusty boxes stacked against the walls. It looked abandoned, untouched for years. But that light was still there, bouncing off the furniture like it was hiding something, or someone. Just as I was about to leave, I saw it, a figure lurking in the shadows, partially obscured. My heart nearly stopped. It wasn't Mr. Harland. This was someone else, standing completely still, watching me. I stumbled back, barely keeping my balance. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept telling myself it was probably just a mannequin or some old statue collecting dust. But deep down, I knew something was off. The next day, I worked up the nerve to ask him, casually, if he'd noticed any issues with his basement lights. His reaction was cold, chilling even. He looked at me, eyes narrowing, and muttered something about private matters. It was so unlike him that it caught me off guard. That night, I couldn't help but look again. The light was stronger, casting a sickly yellow glow that filled the basement, illuminating everything. I could make out the sheets, the furniture, and then I saw it again. This time, it was clearer. That figure was still there, but now it had moved, facing the window with a strange posture, almost like it was bending forward. My curiosity outweighed my fear. I crept outside, determined to get a better look. My hands were shaking as I crouched under his basement window. The glow was stronger than ever, and I could see something that I hadn't noticed before. Symbols, strange and unnerving, drawn on the walls around the basement. They looked old, like something ancient. I leaned closer, squinting, and that's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. My heart pounded as I peered through the window again. The figure moved, a slight, almost imperceptible sway. The scratching grew louder, echoing through the basement. I couldn't breathe. I could feel the hairs on my neck standing on end. Just as I was about to pull away, I saw it, a face. Pale, twisted, with hollow eyes staring right at me. I staggered backward, nearly tripping over my own feet as I scrambled to get away. That night, I couldn't shake the image of those hollow eyes. The next day, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it all. But that night, the lights came back, this time brighter than ever, flashing so intensely they illuminated my own bedroom walls. I called the police. I tried to explain, but they didn't take me seriously. They checked the basement, and everything seemed normal, as they put it. Mr. Harland didn't press charges but warned me with an unsettling grin to stay off his property. But that wasn't the end of it. Every night since, I've seen that same glow pulsing through my blinds, the shadows creeping along my wall. I can't unsee those symbols, those hollow eyes staring back at me. And even though the police didn't find anything, I know I wasn't imagining it. There's something in that basement. Something far worse than an old man keeping secrets. Now, every night, as the lights flicker in my room, I can't help but wonder if one day, those eyes will be watching me from my own window. My name is Michael, and I wish I could say I hadn't heard the rumors. Ever since I moved into this quiet little neighborhood, the talk had been about one thing: Mr. Willis, the man next door. People said he was a bit off, though nobody could quite put their finger on what it was. But that's what drew me here, really. I was looking for peace, and no one seemed to bother him. It started a few weeks after I'd settled in. I was up late one night, working in the silence, when I heard it. A faint, repetitive knocking sound coming from the other side of my wall, as if someone was rapping softly. I brushed it off, thinking it was just an old house creaking. But as days went by, I began noticing it wasn't random. The knocks came at the same time every night, around 2 a.m., and sometimes they lasted for hours. One night, I got curious and pressed my ear to the wall. That's when I heard it, a whisper, low and guttural, like someone muttering something under their breath. The words were garbled, but they were there, and suddenly, my heart was pounding. I pulled back and sat still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next day, I ran into Mr. Willis in his driveway. He looked the same as ever, tall, with hollow cheeks and a pale, almost waxy complexion. I tried to make small talk, and when I mentioned the noises, he chuckled dismissively. "Old houses, you know. They make sounds," he said, his tone light. But his eyes were empty, cold. That night, the sounds got worse. The knocking had turned to something frantic, as if someone were trapped inside and pounding to get out. I lay there, unable to sleep, staring at my ceiling as my mind raced. I started imagining terrible things. Horrors hidden behind the thin walls, desperate souls clawing their way out. The next night, I finally decided to confront him. I went over to his door, but he didn't answer. I rang the bell over and over until he finally appeared, his face barely visible in the dim light from the hallway. He looked irritated, even annoyed. "Look, I don't mean to pry," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I've been hearing strange noises every night." For a moment, he just stood there, his eyes narrowing as he looked me over. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, his voice icy. "There's nothing here. You must be imagining things." And with that, he closed the door in my face. That night, I lay in bed, trying to convince myself that he was right, that maybe it was all in my head. But then I heard it again, louder than ever. I got up and pressed my ear to the wall, my hands shaking as the whispers turned into something else. A soft wailing, like a distant, agonized cry. I froze, the blood draining from my face. This was no trick of the mind. I was sure of it now. I spent the next few nights in a haze, barely able to sleep. I began watching the house, hoping to catch some sign of what was happening. One evening, I saw a shadow move behind Mr. Willis's curtains, a long, twisted shape that seemed to writhe and stretch. But the lights were off, and Mr. Willis had always insisted that he lived alone. The next night, the banging started even louder, like someone was hurling themselves against the wall. It echoed through my bones, and I could feel my heart hammering. The sounds were frantic, desperate, like someone trapped in a nightmare. I wanted to run, to call someone, but something held me back. I had to know what was going on. I decided to wait outside his house, hidden in the shadows of my yard, my eyes glued to his dark windows. Hours passed, but just as I was about to give up, I saw it, a figure slipping past the window, too thin and too tall to be Mr. Willis. It moved like it was dragging itself, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then it disappeared, and silence fell. The next morning, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I went to the police, desperate to make them understand. But they just stared at me, their expressions skeptical as I told them about the noises, the whispers, and the shadows. I insisted something was happening, that something terrible was hidden behind those walls. They said they'd look into it, but I could tell they thought I was losing it. That night, the banging started again, louder than ever, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and crept around the back of his house, pressing my ear to the wall. There it was again, the wailing, the desperate pounding. This time, though, I heard something else. A voice, weak and muffled, pleading, "Help me, please." I froze, my heart hammering as I realized that someone was in there, someone trapped and begging for their life. I backed away, but before I could move, the light from his back porch clicked on. Mr. Willis stood there, watching me with a strange, twisted smile. "Michael," he said softly, his voice eerily calm, "I told you, there's no one here." The next day, he was gone. The house was locked up, empty. I tried to explain it to everyone, but they all looked at me like I was crazy. I broke down his door myself, determined to find out what he was hiding, but there was nothing. No furniture, no signs of life. Just empty rooms, dusty floors, and silence. But every now and then, when I'm lying in bed late at night, I still hear it, the soft knocking, faint but insistent, like someone trapped behind the walls. I had only been living in that house for a few months. The neighborhood was quiet, full of cozy houses with well-kept lawns and a comforting old-fashioned charm that drew me in immediately. But it didn't take long before I started noticing something strange about my elderly neighbor. He was an older man who lived alone, and his behavior, particularly at night, was hard to ignore. At first, it was just the late hours. The lights in his house would stay on well into the night, and I'd catch glimpses of his silhouette through the curtains, pacing or moving things around. I figured he might be a night owl, someone who struggled with sleep. But then, on one cold, quiet night, I saw something that left me uneasy, far beyond simple curiosity. It was past midnight when I heard a dull thud from outside. Rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I looked out my bedroom window and saw him in his backyard, shovel in hand, digging a large, deep hole. He looked exhausted, sweat dripping despite the chilly night air, but his movements were determined, relentless. With every shovel of dirt he tossed to the side, that hole grew deeper. My mind raced to explain what I was seeing. Maybe he was burying garden waste or, as morbid as it sounded, maybe a pet. But the size of that hole, it was simply too large. Just as I was about to turn away, thinking I should mind my own business, I noticed something out of place. Sticking out of the partially dug-up soil was a black garbage bag. It was half covered, but it looked heavy, full, almost deliberately hidden. Something in me knew I should just go back to bed and pretend I hadn't seen a thing, but curiosity got the better of me. With quiet steps, I crept closer, trying to see if there was anything more in that shadowed backyard. And that was my mistake. As I stood at the fence, watching, I suddenly sensed someone watching me. I turned around, and there he was, standing just feet away. His gaze was cold, and his expression, well, it made my blood run cold. His eyes locked onto mine, piercingly clear in the dim light, and he spoke in a low, measured tone that carried a darkness I couldn't quite place. "You should go back inside, Mark," he said, his voice calm yet unervingly intense. "Forget what you saw here, and we'll stay good neighbors." It was more than a warning. It was a threat. I felt it in every syllable. My stomach knotted as I backed away, stumbling slightly in my rush to get back inside. His words echoed in my head as I locked my door and closed the blinds. I couldn't sleep a wink that night, too on edge to even close my eyes. Every time I tried, I'd see that hole, the bag, and his cold, unreadable stare. The next morning, the first thing I did was check his yard. And what I saw made me question my sanity. The hole was gone. The ground was completely flat, and new grass lay perfectly arranged over the spot where he'd been digging, as if nothing had ever happened. It was impossible, and yet it was all there, hiding any trace of the night before. I spent that day in a daze, wondering if I should call the police. But what would I even say? I imagined the look on the officer's face when I tried to explain that my elderly neighbor had dug a hole and threatened me to forget it. The thought of provoking him, too, the way he'd looked at me, it was enough to keep my phone silent. As the days passed, I started to feel like someone was watching me. Shadows seemed to flicker in my peripheral vision, and every noise at night made my pulse race. More than once, I thought I saw movement in his windows, as if he were watching me right back, ensuring I kept my silence. The tension was unbearable. Nights were sleepless, filled with half-imagined footsteps and creaks that seemed to come from inside my house. My paranoia grew, infecting every part of my life, and finally, one night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. With a flashlight and a shaking hand, I went back to his yard while he was out. I started digging in the spot I'd seen him bury that bag, needing to see what lay hidden beneath that fresh grass. My hands were covered in dirt, heart racing as I worked furiously, and finally, I hit something. The corner of a black bag poked through the earth. I reached for it, feeling the plastic crackle beneath my fingers, when a faint but unmistakable smell hit me. I felt a wave of nausea, something primal telling me to drop it and run. Before I could even process my horror, I heard it, a voice, calm and low, almost a whisper, but unmistakably cold. I warned you, Mark. I spun around, my flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated his face. He stood just a few feet away, eyes fixed on me with an unsettling calm, as if he'd known all along I'd return. That night, I fled. I left my own house, without looking back, and I never returned.